Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his face and looked at the dark clouds building in the sky. He had been moving cattle for 3 days now, and his body ached from sitting in the saddle. The Montana wilderness stretched out in all directions, wild and beautiful but also dangerous for those who did not know it well. His truck was loaded with supplies and equipment, following behind as he guided the small herd of cattle to their winter pasture. This move happened every year, but this time felt different. The weather had been strange all week, and Jake could smell snow in the air even though it was only early October. "Come on, girls," he called to the cattle, clicking his tongue to keep them moving. "Just a few more miles." But the cattle seemed nervous too. They kept stopping and looking around, their big eyes wide with worry. Jake had worked with cattle his whole life, and he knew when something was wrong. Animals could sense danger better than people most of the time. The first snowflakes started falling around noon. Jake pulled his hat down tighter and zipped up his jacket. A little snow was not unusual, but the way the wind was picking up made him uneasy. He reached for his phone to check the weather, but there was no signal out here. There never was. By 2 o'clock, the snow was falling harder. The wind howled across the open land, pushing the white flakes sideways. Jake could barely see 50 feet ahead. This was turning into a real blizzard, and he was still miles from where he needed to be. "This is not good," he said to himself, his words lost in the wind. The cattle were getting scared. They bunched together and tried to turn back. But Jake pushed them forward. He knew they needed to reach shelter soon, or they would all be in serious trouble. His grandfather had always told him that Montana weather could turn deadly in minutes, and now Jake understood what he meant. Jake rode back to his truck, snow sticking to his clothes and face. He tried to start the engine, but it just made a clicking sound. He tried again. Nothing. The cold had killed his battery, and he was stranded. No, Jake said, hitting the steering wheel with his fist. "Not now." He got out of the truck and opened the hood. Snow immediately filled his eyes and mouth. The engine was covered in ice, and he could see that several hoses had frozen and cracked. Even if he could get it started, it would not run for long. Jake looked around, trying to figure out what to do. The cattle were huddled together about 100 yards away, their backs to the wind. He could barely see them through the blowing snow. His horse stood next to the truck, shaking and covered in white. He had to make a choice. He could stay with the truck and hope someone would find him, but no one knew exactly where he was. His ranch hands thought he would be gone for 4 days, so they would not start looking for him until tomorrow at the earliest. Or he could try to find shelter and come back for the truck later. Jake decided to keep moving. He climbed back on his horse and tried to follow the fence line that marked the edge of his property. If he could find the old cabin that his father had built years ago, he might be able to wait out the storm. But the snow was so thick now that he could not see the fence posts. His horse stumbled in the deep snow, and Jake almost fell off. The animal was tired and cold, just like him. Ice was forming on the horse's mane and around its nose. They had to find shelter soon. After what felt like hours, Jake saw something dark ahead. It looked like a gap in the fence, maybe a gate. He rode toward it, hoping it would lead to the cabin or at least to better shelter. But when he got closer, he realized it was not a gate at all. The fence was broken, with posts lying on the ground and wire tangled in the snow. Jake looked through the gap. On the other side, the land looked the same, but something felt different about it. Maybe it was just his imagination, but the wind seemed quieter here and the snow did not blow as hard. His horse wanted to go through the gap, pulling toward the opening. "I guess we don't have much choice," Jake said. He let his horse carry him through the broken fence. He did not know it, but he had just crossed onto land that had been sacred to the Blackfeet people for hundreds of years. This was not just any piece of ground. It was a place where tribal ceremonies had been held for generations, where medicine men had come to pray and seek visions. The snow continued to fall, but Jake noticed that the wind was not as strong here. There were more trees, which helped block the worst of the storm. His horse seemed calmer too, walking with more confidence even though the snow was getting deeper. Jake's hands were so cold that he could not feel the reins anymore. He tucked them under his arms, trying to warm them up. His feet felt like blocks of ice in his boots, and his face hurt from the wind and cold. He had been in bad weather before, but this was different. This storm was trying to kill him. As the afternoon turned to evening, the temperature dropped even more. Jake's thoughts became fuzzy and he had trouble staying awake. He knew these were signs of hypothermia, the condition that killed ranchers and hikers every year in Montana. His body was shutting down to save energy. Stay awake, he told himself. Keep moving. But his horse was struggling too. The animal's steps were getting slower and less steady. Ice had formed around its mouth and nose, making it hard to breathe. They were both running out of time. Jake tried to think clearly about where he was, but everything looked the same in the snow. White ground, white trees, white sky. He had lost all sense of direction. For all he knew, he could be walking in circles. Then, his horse stopped. Jake tried to make it keep going, but the animal would not move. It stood with its head down, breathing hard. Steam rose from its body in the cold air. "Come on," Jake said, but his voice was weak. "We have to keep going." The horse took a few more steps and then stopped again. This time it would not move no matter what Jake did. He realized that his horse was telling him something important. They could not go any further. Jake slid down from the saddle, his legs shaking. The snow came up to his knees and each step was a struggle. He looked around for any kind of shelter, but all he could see were trees and rocks covered in white. That was when the dizziness hit him. Jake fell to his knees in the snow, his vision going dark around the edges. He tried to get up, but his body would not obey him. The cold was winning. Jake Morrison, a man who had worked outside his whole life, who thought he knew how to handle any weather, was about to die in a place he did not even know. He had wandered onto sacred ground by accident, and now that same ground might become his grave. He closed his eyes and felt the snow covering him like a blanket. In the distance, he thought he heard something, but it might have been just the wind. His horse stood over him as if trying to protect him, but there was nothing the animal could do. The blessed land had claimed another soul, or so it seemed. Elena Crow Feather pulled her heavy coat tighter as she walked through the falling snow. She made this trip every month, checking on the sacred sites that her people had used for prayer and ceremony for hundreds of years. It was her job as the cultural preservation coordinator, but it was also her calling. These places held the spirits of her ancestors, and someone needed to watch over them. The storm had come earlier than expected, but Elena was not worried. She had grown up on this land and knew every rock, every tree, every hidden path. Her grandmother had taught her to read the signs in nature, and her mother had shown her which plants could heal and which could harm. Elena carried this knowledge in her heart. She walked with steady steps through the deep snow, following a trail that most people could not even see. Her long black hair was braided down her back, and eagle feathers hung from a leather cord around her neck. These feathers had belonged to her grandfather, a medicine man who had been respected by the whole tribe. Elena was 32 years old, but she looked younger. Her face was smooth and brown, with high cheekbones and dark eyes that seemed to see everything. She moved like someone who belonged in this wild place, quiet and sure of herself. As she walked, Elena said prayers in the old language that her grandmother had taught her. She asked the spirits to watch over her people and to keep the sacred places safe. These prayers had been said on this land for more years than anyone could count. The snow was falling harder now, but Elena was not in a hurry. She knew that the storm would pass, as all storms did. She had seen worse weather than this, and she always found her way home. The land would protect her, just as she protected it. When Elena reached the first sacred site, she stopped and looked around carefully. This was a place where young men had come to seek visions, fasting and praying until the spirits spoke to them. The rocks were arranged in a special pattern that had meaning for her people. Everything looked normal, with no signs that anyone had been here. She moved on to the next site, a grove of old cottonwood trees where women had come to give birth for generations. The trees were bare now, their branches reaching up into the gray sky like fingers. Elena touched one of the trunks and felt the life still flowing inside, even in winter. But when she reached the medicine wheel, the most sacred place of all, Elena stopped and stared. There in the snow she could see tracks, boot prints and horse hooves, fresh enough that the falling snow had not covered them completely. Elena's heart started beating faster. Outsiders were not supposed to be here. This was tribal land, and it was protected by law. More than that, it was protected by something deeper than law. This place was holy to her people. She followed the tracks, moving carefully through the snow. The prints led toward the center of the medicine wheel, where a circle of stones had been placed by her ancestors long ago. Elena had been coming here since she was a child, and she knew that something was wrong. That was when she saw the horse. The animal stood alone near the stones, covered in snow and shivering. Its reins hung loose, and its saddle was empty. Elena approached slowly, speaking soft words to calm the frightened animal. Horses knew her, and this one did not try to run away. "Where is your rider?" Elena asked, stroking the horse's neck. She looked around and saw a dark shape in the snow near the horse's feet. At first, she thought it might be a fallen log or a large rock, but when she got closer, Elena realized it was a man. He was lying on his side, covered in snow, not moving. Elena knelt down and brushed the snow away from his face. He was white, probably in his 30s, with brown hair and a beard. His skin was blue-gray, and she could barely see him breathing. Elena knew she was looking at a man who was close to death. For a moment, she did not know what to do. This man was a trespasser on sacred ground. According to tribal law, she should call the police and let them handle it. Her people had learned to be careful about outsiders, especially white men, who came onto their land without permission. But Elena was also a healer. Her grandmother had taught her that all life was sacred, no matter what color a person's skin was, and this man was dying. If she left him here while she went to get help, he would be dead before anyone could come. Elena made her decision quickly. She would save this man's life first and worry about the rules later. She checked his pulse, which was weak and slow. His body was cold, but she could still feel life in him. Elena had treated hypothermia before, and she knew what to do. The most important thing was to get him warm and dry as soon as possible. Elena's cabin was about half a mile away, hidden in a grove of pine trees. She had built it herself with help from her brother, using traditional methods that her grandfather had taught them. It was small but warm, with a wood stove and thick walls. But first she had to get the man there. Elena was strong from years of outdoor work, but the man was bigger than her and heavy with water-soaked clothes. She managed to get him sitting up, then standing with her shoulder under his arm. The horse watched as she half-carried, half-dragged the unconscious stranger through the snow. "Help me," Elena said to the horse. "I cannot do this alone." The horse seemed to understand. It walked beside them, and Elena was able to lean the man against the animal's side when she needed to rest. Step by step, they made their way through the storm toward the cabin. By the time Elena got the man to her door, she was exhausted. Her back ached, and her legs shook from the effort. But she was not finished yet. She still had to save his life. Elena dragged the man inside and laid him on the floor near the wood stove. She quickly built up the fire until the room was warm, then began removing his wet clothes. His jeans and shirt were frozen, and his boots were full of snow. Everything had to come off. She wrapped him in dry blankets and put him on the couch, closest to the fire. Then Elena made hot tea with special herbs that would help warm his body from the inside. She opened his mouth and poured small amounts of the tea between his lips, being careful not to choke him. For the next hour, Elena worked to bring the man back to life. She rubbed his hands and feet to get the blood flowing again. She checked his pulse every few minutes and watched his breathing. Slowly, his skin began to return to a normal color. As Elena worked, she wondered who this man was and how he had ended up on sacred ground. His clothes were those of a rancher or cowboy, and his hands were rough from outdoor work. He wore a wedding ring, so somewhere a woman was probably worried about him. But there was something else about this man that Elena noticed. He had a peaceful look on his face, even unconscious. Most people who came close to death looked afraid, but this man looked calm. It was as if the sacred land had welcomed him even though he was a stranger. Elena also noticed his horse, which had followed them to the cabin and now stood outside the window. The animal could have run away when the storm started, but it had stayed with its owner. That told Elena something good about the man's character. Animals knew things about people that other people sometimes missed. As the evening went on, the man's breathing became stronger and more regular. His pulse was steadier, and Elena could see that he was going to live. She had pulled him back from the edge of death. But now Elena faced a different problem. When this man woke up, what would she tell him? How would she explain where he was, and why she had helped him? And what would she do if he caused trouble for her people? Elena looked at the sleeping stranger and made another decision. She would trust the sacred land. If the spirits had brought this man here, then maybe there was a reason. Maybe his arrival was not an accident at all. Outside, the storm continued to blow, but inside the cabin it was warm and safe. Elena sat in a chair near the fire watching over the man she had saved. She did not know it yet, but her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. The guardian had found the lost soul, and now both of their fates were tied together by the sacred ground that had brought them together. Jake woke up slowly, like swimming up from the bottom of a deep lake. His body felt heavy and strange, and for a moment he could not remember where he was. The last thing he remembered was falling in the snow, so cold that he could not feel his hands or feet. But now he was warm. Jake opened his eyes and saw wooden walls and a ceiling with exposed beams. A fire crackled in a stone fireplace nearby, and soft light filled the room. This was not his house, and it was not any place he recognized. Jake tried to sit up, but his head spun and he fell back onto the couch. His throat was dry, and his muscles ached like he had been sick for a long time. He was wearing clothes that were not his own, soft flannel pants and a wool sweater that smelled like pine trees and wood smoke. "You are awake," said a woman's voice. Jake turned his head and saw her sitting in a chair near the fire. She was Native American, with long black hair and dark eyes that watched him carefully. She looked to be about his age, maybe a little younger, with a face that was both beautiful and serious. "Where am I?" Jake asked, his voice rough and weak. "You are safe," the woman said. "That is what matters right now." Jake tried again to sit up, moving more slowly this time. The room spun a little, but he managed to stay upright. He looked around and saw that he was in a small cabin with handmade furniture and traditional Native American decorations on the walls. Everything was clean and organized, with the kind of care that showed someone took pride in their home. "How long have I been here?" Jake asked. 3 days, the woman said. "You almost died out there. Your body temperature was so low that I was not sure you would make it." Jake stared at her. 3 days? His ranch hands would be looking for him. By now, his cattle were probably scattered all over the countryside. And who was this woman who had saved his life? "I'm Jake Morrison," he said. "I own a ranch about 10 miles south of here." The woman nodded. "I know who you are. I found your wallet in your coat pocket. My name is Elena Crowfeather." Jake recognized the last name. Crowfeather was a well-known family on the Blackfeet Reservation. But if that was true, then he was on tribal land, which meant he had been trespassing. No wonder Elena looked at him with such careful eyes. "I'm sorry," Jake said quickly. "I didn't mean to come onto your land. I got lost in the storm, and my truck broke down. I was just trying to find shelter." Elena studied his face for a long moment. "You were found at the medicine wheel," she said. "Do you know what that means?" Jake shook his head. He had heard of medicine wheels, but did not know much about them. "It is one of our most sacred places," Elena explained. "My people have been going there for ceremony and prayer for hundreds of years. Outsiders are not supposed to be there." Jake felt his stomach drop. He had not just trespassed on tribal land. He had stumbled into a holy place. That could cause serious trouble for him and his family. "I really didn't know," Jake said. "I was just trying to survive." "I believe you," Elena said, and some of the tension left her voice. "But that does not change the fact that you were there. I should have called the tribal police when I found you." "Why didn't you?" Jake asked. Elena was quiet for a moment, looking into the fire. "Because you were dying," she said finally, "and because something about finding you there felt meant to be." Jake did not know what to say to that. He was not a religious man, but he had to admit that surviving that storm felt like a miracle. If Elena had not found him, he would be dead and buried under the snow by now. "Thank you," Jake said, "for saving my life. I owe you everything." Elena shook her head. "You do not owe me anything. I did what anyone should do when they find someone in need." But Jake knew that was not true. Many people would have followed the rules and called for help instead of risking themselves to save a stranger. Elena had put herself in danger to help him, and now she might face consequences from her own people for bringing an outsider to her home. Over the next few days, as Jake slowly got his strength back, he and Elena began to talk. At first, their conversations were careful and polite. Elena brought him food and checked on his health, while Jake tried to stay out of her way and not cause trouble. But gradually, they began to open up to each other. Elena told Jake about her work preserving the cultural sites and traditions of her people. She had studied at the university but chose to come back to the reservation because she believed the old ways were important and needed to be protected. Jake told Elena about his ranch and the struggles he faced trying to keep it running. Cattle prices were low, the weather had been bad for 2 years in a row, and he was behind on his mortgage payments. He loved the land and the life, but sometimes he wondered if he would be the last Morrison to work the family ranch. "My grandfather started that ranch in 1943, Jake said one evening as they sat by the fire. "He came back from the war with nothing but a few $100s and a dream. He bought the land cheap because nobody else wanted it." "What made him choose that particular place?" Elena asked. "He said it called to him," Jake replied. "I used to think that was just an old man's way of talking, but now I'm not so sure." Elena looked at him with interest. "What do you mean?" Jake hesitated, not sure how to explain something he did not fully understand himself. "When I was lost in the storm, my horse led me to that gap in the fence. I didn't make the choice to cross onto your land. It was like something was pulling me there." Elena nodded slowly. "The medicine wheel is a place of power. Some people say it can call to those who need healing or guidance." "Do you believe that?" Jake asked. "I have seen things that I cannot explain with logic," Elena said. "My grandmother always told me to trust what the heart knows, even when the mind does not understand." As Jake recovered, Elena began to share more about her people's history and beliefs. She took him to see some of the less sacred sites around her cabin, explaining the meaning behind the stone circles and the significance of certain plants and animals. Jake was fascinated. He had lived next to the reservation his whole life, but had never really understood the depth of the culture and spiritual beliefs of the Blackfeet people. Elena's knowledge seemed to connect everything in nature, from the smallest flower to the movements of the stars. "Your people see the world very differently than mine do," Jake said one day as they walked through the woods. "Not your people and my people," Elena corrected gently. "We are all people. We just have different ways of understanding the same world." It was during one of these conversations that Elena made a discovery that changed everything. Jake was telling her about his grandfather's journals, which he had found in the attic after the old man died. The journals contained stories about the early days of the ranch and the challenges of starting a new life in Montana. "Your grandfather wrote about the winter of 1947, Elena said suddenly. "What did he say about that time?" Jake thought for a moment. "It was a terrible winter. He wrote about how the snow lasted for months and how people were running out of food. He said he helped some of the local families get through it." Elena's eyes widened. "Local families? Do you mean native families?" "I think so," Jake said. "He wrote about taking supplies to people who lived across the way. I always figured he meant the reservation." Elena was quiet for a long time, and Jake could see that she was thinking hard about something. "My grandmother told me stories about that winter," Elena said finally. "She said a white rancher brought food and medicine to the reservation when The government supplies did not come. She said he saved many lives, including her own family. Jake stared at Elena. Are you saying that my grandfather— I think your grandfather was the man my grandmother talked about, Elena said. She always said that man was a friend to our people, and that the spirits would remember his kindness. Suddenly, Jake's presence at the medicine wheel took on a different meaning. It was not just an accident or even a spiritual calling. It was a connection that went back 2 generations, a link between his family and Elena's that had been waiting all these years to be discovered. Maybe that's why the land called to you, Elena said softly. Maybe it was time for the circle to be completed. Jake felt something shift inside him, like a door opening to a room he had never known existed. For the first time since the storm, he began to wonder if getting lost that night might have been the best thing that ever happened to him. But he also knew that the real test was yet to come. Soon he would have to return to his world, and Elena would have to face her people's questions about helping him. The easy part was over, the hard part was just beginning. The peaceful days at Elena's cabin came to a sudden end on Jake's 7th day there. He was feeling strong enough to walk around outside and had been helping Elena with small chores around the property. The storm had passed, leaving the world covered in clean white snow that sparkled in the sunlight. Jake was splitting firewood when he heard the sound of a truck engine coming through the trees. Elena came out of the cabin, and he could see worry on her face. Visitors were rare at her cabin, especially during winter. A red pickup truck came into view, driving fast and throwing snow in all directions. It stopped near the cabin, and a young Native American man jumped out. He was maybe 25 years old with long black hair and an angry expression on his face. "Elena," the young man shouted. "Where have you been? We've been looking everywhere. For you." "Tommy," Elena said calmly. "What's wrong? Why are you so upset?" Tommy Crowfeather was Elena's nephew, the son of her older brother. Jake could see the family resemblance in their faces. But where Elena was peaceful and thoughtful, Tommy looked like he was ready for a fight. "What's wrong?" Tommy repeated, his voice getting louder. "I'll tell you what's wrong. The mining company got their permits. They're going to start digging up the burial grounds in 2 months, and the tribal council has given up fighting it." Elena's face went pale. "That's not possible. The lawyers said we had more time." "The lawyers were wrong," Tommy said bitterly. "The mining company found some old treaty language that gives them the right to the minerals under the eastern section. They're going to strip mine the whole area." Jake watched this conversation with growing concern. He did not understand all the details, but he could see that something terrible was happening to Elena's people. "What burial grounds?" Jake asked. Tommy turned to look at Jake for the first time, and his eyes narrowed. "Who is this guy? What's a white man doing here?" Elena stepped between them. "Tommy, this is Jake Morrison. He got lost in the storm, and I helped him." "Jake, this is my nephew Tommy." Tommy's expression turned from suspicious to angry. "Morrison? As in Morrison Ranch? Elena, do you know who this man is?" "I know exactly who he is," Elena said firmly. "And right now that doesn't matter. Tell me more about the mining company." But Tommy was not ready to drop the subject. He pointed at Jake with a shaking finger. "This man's family has been stealing our land for generations. His grandfather probably helped write the treaties that are being used against us now." "That's not true," Jake said, his own anger rising. "My grandfather was a friend to your people." "Friend?" Tommy laughed, but there was no humor in it. "White men don't have native friends. They have native victims." Elena held up her hands. "Stop, both of you. Fighting with each other won't help anything. Tommy, tell me about the burial grounds." Tommy took a deep breath and tried to calm down, but Jake could see the rage still burning in his eyes. "Mountain Mining Corporation has the legal right to dig up everything from Boulder Creek to the old trading post. That includes the cemetery where our great-grandparents are buried." Jake felt sick to his stomach. He knew the area Tommy was talking about. It was on the eastern edge of the reservation near the border with his own ranch. The thought of bulldozers digging up graves made him angry too. "How is that legal?" Jake asked. "There must be laws protecting burial sites." "There are laws," Tommy said, "but money talks louder than laws. Mountain mining has lawyers and politicians in their pocket. They've been planning this for years. Elena sat down heavily on the cabin steps. Jake had never seen her look so defeated. "How much time do we have?" she asked. 60 days, Tommy said. "They start preliminary work in March. By summer, everything will be gone." Jake's mind was racing. He knew Mountain Mining Corporation. They had approached him twice in the past year about mineral rights on his land. Both times, he had turned them down because he did not want industrial equipment tearing up his pastures. "Wait a minute," Jake said. "If they're planning to mine that area, they'll need access roads. How are they planning to get their equipment in there?" Tommy looked at him suspiciously. "What do you care?" "Just answer the question," Jake said. "The eastern section of the reservation is landlocked. The only way to get heavy equipment in there is through private land." Elena raised her head and looked at Jake with understanding in her eyes. "Your land," she said softly. Jake nodded. "My family owns the only practical access route. Mountain mining would need easement rights to cross my property." Tommy's expression changed from anger to hope. "Do they have those rights?" "No," Jake said. "They've asked for them, but I said no both times." For a moment, the three of them stood in silence, each thinking about what this meant. Without access, through Jake's ranch, Mountain Mining would have a much harder time getting to the burial grounds. It might be enough to stop the project entirely. But Tommy's hope quickly turned back to suspicion. "Why should we trust you?" he asked Jake. "How do we know you won't sell out to the mining company as soon as you get home?" It was a fair question, and Jake knew it. He was a white rancher facing financial problems, and Mountain Mining had deep pockets. From Tommy's perspective, there was no reason to trust him. "Because my grandfather would roll over in his grave if I let them dig up your ancestors," Jake said. "And because Elena saved my life. I owe her more than I can ever repay." Tommy looked back and forth between Jake and Elena, and Jake could see him trying to decide whether to believe them. "There's something else," Elena said quietly. "Jake's grandfather was the rancher who helped our people during the winter of 1947. His family has been connected to ours for longer than any of us knew." Tommy's mouth fell open. "The man grandmother always talked about? The one who brought food and medicine?" Elna nodded. "I think so. And now his grandson has been brought back to us just when we need help the most." Tommy was quiet for a long time, looking at Jake with new eyes. Finally, he spoke. "Even if that's true, it doesn't solve our problem. The mining company will just keep pressuring him until he gives in. They have ways of making people do what they want." Jake knew Tommy was right. Mountain Mining had already offered him a substantial amount of money for the easement rights. If his financial situation got worse, he might not have a choice but to sell. And there were other ways they could pressure him too, legal and otherwise. "What if we fought them together?" Elena asked. "What if we found a way to challenge their permits legally?" Tommy shook his head. "We've already tried that. The tribal lawyers say we don't have a case. The old treaties are too clear about mineral rights." "Then we need new lawyers," Jake said. "Better lawyers." "With what money?" Tommy asked. "The tribe is barely keeping the clinic open. We can't afford the kind of legal team it would take to fight Mountain Mining." They were all quiet again, each lost in their own thoughts. Jake could see the despair on Elena's face, and it broke his heart. She had saved his life, and now he wanted to save the things that mattered to her. But he was just one man with his own problems. What could he really do? That's when Jake remembered something. His grandfather had written in his journal. There had been pages about the legal battles over land ownership in the early days, and something about mineral rights that had never been properly transferred. "Elena," Jake said slowly, "you said your grandmother told stories about my grandfather. Did she ever mention anything about legal documents, papers that he might have given to your people?" Elena thought for a moment. "She did say something about papers that were supposed to protect certain areas from development, but I always thought she was talking about the treaty that established the reservation boundaries." "Maybe she wasn't," Jake said, his excitement growing. "My grandfather's journals mention some kind of legal agreement about mineral rights. I never paid much attention to it because I thought it was just old paperwork. But what if it's something that could help us? Tommy looked skeptical. Even if such papers exist, they would be 70 years old. No court would honor them now. Maybe not, Jake said. But it's worth looking into. At the very least, it might buy us some time. Elena stood up and Jake could see a spark of hope returning to her eyes. When can you check your grandfather's papers? As soon as I get home, Jake said. But I have to warn you, I might not find anything useful, and even if I do, it might not be enough to stop mountain mining. It's more hope than we had an hour ago, Elena said. Tommy was still not convinced, but Jake could see that he was beginning to consider the possibility. What's in this for you? Tommy asked Jake. Why would you risk your own interest to help us? Jake looked at Elena, then back at Tommy. Because it's the right thing to do, he said simply. And because some things are more important than money. As Tommy drove away to tell the tribal council about this new development, Jake and Elena sat by the fire in her cabin. Both of them knew that the easy part was over. Soon Jake would have to return to his ranch and face the reality of his situation. The mining company would not give up easily, and the pressure on him would only increase. Are you sure about this? Elena asked. Fighting mountain mining could cost you everything. Jake reached over and took her hand. Elena, a week ago I was a man who had lost his way in more ways than one. You didn't just save my life. You showed me what really matters. Jake's return to his ranch was harder than he had expected. After a week in Elena's peaceful cabin, his own home felt cold and empty. The house needed repairs he could not afford, and bills were stacked on his kitchen table like accusations. His ranch hands, Mike and Carlos, had managed to find most of the scattered cattle, but several were still missing, and probably dead. Boss, we were worried sick about you, Mike said as Jake walked into the barn. Mike was an older man who had worked for Jake's father before him. When that storm hit and you didn't come back, we thought the worst. I'm sorry I worried you, Jake said. My truck broke down, and I had to wait out the storm. Did mountain mining come by while I was gone? Carlos nodded. 3 times. That Mr. Peterson was getting pretty pushy about wanting an answer. Said they couldn't wait much longer for you to make up your mind. Jake's stomach tightened. Richard Peterson was mountain mining's land acquisition specialist, a smooth-talking man in an expensive suit who acted like he was doing you a favor by taking your land. Jake had dealt with his type before and did not trust him at all. What did you tell him? Jake asked. Same thing you told us to say, Mike replied, that you'd give them an answer when you were ready. Jake nodded, but he knew Peterson would not wait much longer. Mining companies worked on tight schedules, and they did not like delays. The pressure would only get worse from here. That evening, Jake went up to the attic to look for his grandfather's journals. The space was dusty and filled with boxes of old papers, family photos, and forgotten belongings. It took him 2 hours to find what he was looking for, but finally he pulled out a wooden chest that contained his grandfather's most important documents. Jake carried the chest down to the kitchen and opened it under the bright light. Inside were land deeds, cattle records, and several leather-bound journals filled with his grandfather's careful handwriting. Jake had read some of these years ago, but now he was looking for something specific. He found what he was looking for in the journal from 1947. His grandfather had written about meetings with tribal leaders and government officials about mineral rights and land use agreements. But the details were confusing, full of legal language that Jake did not understand. One entry caught his attention. Met with Chief Standing Bear today about the eastern boundary question. We signed papers that should protect the sacred sites from any future mining. I pray this will be enough to honor the promise I made to his people. Jake's heart started beating faster. This sounded like what Elena had hoped for. But where were the actual papers? He searched through the chest again and found a manila envelope marked Legal Documents, Blackfeet Agreement. Inside the envelope were 3 pages of typed legal text, yellowed with age but still readable. Jake tried to understand what they said, but the language was too complicated. He would need a lawyer to tell him if these documents were important. The next morning, Jake drove to town to see Sam Martinez, the only lawyer in the area who Jake could afford. Sam's office was above the hardware store, and his law degree was 20 years old. But he was honest and knew the local legal history better than anyone. "Jake, good to see you," Sam said as Jake climbed the narrow stairs to his office. "I heard you got caught in that storm. Lucky to be alive." "That's one way to look at it," Jake said. He handed Sam the documents. "I need you to tell me what these papers mean." Sam put on his reading glasses and studied the documents carefully. His expression grew more serious as he read. After 10 minutes, he looked up at Jake with surprise. "Where did you get these?" Sam asked. "They were in my grandfather's papers." "Are they important?" Sam whistled softly. "Jake, if these documents are legitimate, they could change everything. Your grandfather and the tribal leaders signed an agreement that gives the Blackfeet permanent protection rights over certain areas, including mineral rights." Jake felt a surge of hope. "Does that mean mountain mining can't dig up the burial grounds?" "It might," Sam said carefully. "But there are problems. First, we'd have to prove these documents are authentic and legally binding. Second, we'd need to file them with the proper courts and government agencies. And third, mountain mining has lawyers who will fight this every step of the way." "How much would all that cost?" Jake asked. Though he was afraid of the answer, Sam was quiet for a moment. "To do it right, probably $100,000, maybe more. Mining companies don't give up easily, especially when there's this much money involved." Jake's hopes crashed. He did not have $100,000. He barely had $1,000. His ranch was already mortgaged to the limit and his credit was no good. "There's something else you should know," Sam continued. "Mountain Mining called me yesterday. They want to meet with you about the easement rights. They're prepared to make you a very generous offer." "How generous?" Jake asked. $2 million, Sam said, "for a simple easement that would let them cross your land to reach the mining site." Jake stared at Sam in shock. $2 million was more money than he had ever dreamed of having. It would pay off all his debts, save his ranch, and set him up for life. All he had to do was let some trucks drive across his back pasture. But Jake also knew what that money would cost. It would mean the destruction of the burial grounds that Elena's people held sacred. It would mean bulldozers digging up the graves of people who had lived on this land for thousands of years. "When do they want an answer?" Jake asked. "End of the week," Sam said. "They're starting preliminary work in 6 weeks and they need to know about the access route." Jake left Sam's office with his head spinning. $2 million would solve all his problems, but it would create new ones that were much worse. How could he look Elena in the eye if he took mountain mining's money? How could he live with himself knowing that he had sold out her people? But how could he turn down the money when his ranch was failing and his workers depended on him for their jobs? Mike and Carlos had families to feed. If Jake lost the ranch, they would lose their homes too. When Jake got back to the ranch, Richard Peterson was waiting for him. Peterson was a thin man in his 50s with gray hair and cold blue eyes. He smiled when he saw Jake, but it was not a friendly smile. "Mr. Morrison," Peterson said, extending his hand. "I'm glad you're safe. We were concerned when we heard about the storm." Jake shook Peterson's hand but did not return the smile. "What can I do for you, Mr. Peterson?" "I think you know why I'm here," Peterson said. "We need to finalize the easement agreement. I'm prepared to offer you $2.5 million for access rights across your property." Jake's eyes widened. The offer had gone up by $500,000 in just one day. That told him how badly mountain mining needed his land. "That's a lot of money," Jake said carefully. "It is indeed," Peterson agreed. "More than enough to pay off your debts and modernize your operation. I understand you've been having some financial difficulties." Jake did not like the way Peterson said that, as if he had been investigating Jake's personal business. "How do you know about my finances?" Peterson's smile got wider. "It's a small town, Mr. Morrison. People talk. I also know that you missed 2 mortgage payments last year, and that your cattle operation has been losing money for 3 years running." Jake felt anger rising in his chest. This man had been digging into his private affairs, probably trying to find ways to pressure him into selling. What's your point, Mr. Peterson? My point is that this offer could solve all your problems. You'd be crazy not to take it. And what if I don't want to take it? Jake asked. Peterson's smile disappeared. Then you'd be making a serious mistake. This is a limited-time offer, Mr. Morrison. If you turn us down, we'll find another way to access the mining site. And you'll be left with nothing but a failing ranch and a mountain of debt. Jake could hear the threat in Peterson's voice. Mountain Mining was not just offering him money. They were warning him what would happen if he refused. I need time to think about it, Jake said. You have until Friday, Peterson said, getting back into his expensive car. After that, the offer expires. That evening, Jake sat alone in his kitchen, staring at the legal documents that might save Elena's sacred land. Around him were bills he could not pay and repair estimates he could not afford. The choice before him seemed impossible. If he took Mountain Mining's money, he would save his ranch but destroy something that was sacred to Elena's people. If he refused the money, he would probably lose everything his family had built over 3 generations. Jake picked up his phone and dialed Elena's number. When she answered, just hearing her voice made him feel better. Jake, Elena said, I was hoping you would call. Did you find anything in your grandfather's papers? Jake told her about the documents and what Sam Martinez had said about them. He could hear the excitement in Elena's voice when he described the legal protections his grandfather had tried to establish. But then, Jake had to tell her about Mountain Mining's offer and the deadline he was facing. $2.5 million, Elena said softly. That's enough to save your ranch. Elena, I want you to know that money doesn't matter to me, not if it means hurting your people. There was a long silence on the phone. When Elena spoke again, her voice was full of sadness. Jake, I can't ask you to sacrifice everything for us. The next 2 days were the longest of Jake's life. He tried to focus on ranch work, but his mind kept wandering to the impossible choice he faced. Every time he looked at his failing equipment or the bills on his kitchen table, Mountain Mining's offer seemed more tempting. But every time he thought about Elena and the sacred burial grounds, taking their money felt like betrayal. On Wednesday evening, Elena called with an invitation that surprised him. I want you to come to the reservation tomorrow, she said. There are some people I'd like you to meet and some things I want to show you. It might help you understand what we're really fighting for. Jake agreed, though he was nervous about visiting the reservation. He had lived next to it his whole life but had rarely set foot on tribal land. Most of his interactions with native people had been brief and business-related. He did not know what to expect. The next morning, Jake drove to the meeting place Elena had described, a community center near the tribal headquarters. Elena was waiting for him in the parking lot, wearing a traditional dress with intricate beadwork and carrying a leather bag that looked very old. Thank you for coming, Elena said, as Jake got out of his truck. I know this isn't easy for you. I want to understand, Jake said honestly. I want to know what I'd be helping to destroy if I take Mountain Mining's money. Elena led him inside the community center, where about 20 people were gathered around tables covered with maps, photographs, and documents. Most were Native Americans of various ages, but Jake was surprised to see a few white people in the group as well. Everyone, this is Jake Morrison, Elena announced. His grandfather was the rancher who helped our people during the harsh winter of 1947. An elderly native woman with white hair and sharp eyes studied Jake's face carefully. You look like him, she said finally. I was just a girl then, but I remember your grandfather. He brought medicine when my little brother was sick. With pneumonia, that medicine saved his life. Jake felt a lump in his throat. What was your brother's name? Joseph Standing Bear, the woman said. He became our tribal chairman many years later. He died 5 years ago, but he never forgot what your grandfather did for our family. Other people began sharing their own stories about Jake's grandfather. Some remembered him bringing food during hard times. Others talked about how he had helped settle disputes between tribal members and white ranchers. Jake had known his grandfather was a good man, but he had not realized the depth of his connection to the Blackfeet community. Your grandfather understood something that many white people don't. said an older man named Robert Crowfeather, who Jake realized was Elena's father. He understood that we are all connected to this land, and that protecting it benefits everyone. Robert spread out a large map on the table. Let me show you what mountain mining wants to destroy. The map showed the eastern section of the reservation, in detail. Red lines marked the areas where the mining company planned to dig. Jake could see that the affected land included not just the burial grounds, but also a creek that provided water to several communities, a grove of trees that had spiritual significance and grazing areas that tribal members used for their cattle. The burial ground is just the beginning, Robert explained. Once they start digging, the contamination will spread. The creek will be poisoned, the wildlife will leave, and the whole ecosystem will be ruined. A younger man named David added, My family has been ranching on this land for 4 generations, just like yours, Jake. If mountain mining destroys the water sources, we'll lose everything too. Jake studied the map and realized something that made his stomach drop. The contamination would spread to my land too, wouldn't it? Robert nodded grimly. The creek flows through your property before it reaches ours. If mountain mining pollutes it upstream, your cattle would be drinking poisoned water within a year. Jake stared at the map in shock. Mountain mining had not told him about the environmental impact on his own ranch. They had offered him money for the easement rights, but had not mentioned that their operation might destroy his water sources and make his land worthless. They didn't tell you about that, did they? Elena asked, reading the expression on Jake's face. No, Jake said angrily. They made it sound like a simple access road, a few trucks crossing my back pasture. An environmental scientist named Dr. Sarah Wilson, one of the white people in the group, opened a laptop computer and showed Jake satellite photos of other mountain mining operations. This is what they did in Wyoming, Dr. Wilson explained. And this is Colorado. In both cases, they promised minimal environmental impact. In both cases, they left behind dead rivers and poisoned ground. Jake looked at the photos and felt sick. The mining sites looked like moonscapes, with huge pits in the ground and piles of waste rock stretching for miles. Nothing lived in these places anymore. Why didn't anyone tell me about this before? Jake asked. Mining companies are very good at hiding information, Dr. Wilson said. They have teams of lawyers and public relations experts whose job is to make their operations sound harmless. They don't talk about the long-term damage until it's too late to stop them. Elena's father put his hand on Jake's shoulder. Now you understand why this fight is about more than just our sacred sites. It's about the survival of our whole community, and yours too. Jake spent the rest of the day learning about the history and culture of the Blackfeet people. Elena took him to see the burial grounds that mountain mining wanted to destroy. They walked among ancient stone markers and listened to the wind blow through sacred trees that had stood for hundreds of years. My great-great-grandmother is buried here, Elena said, kneeling beside a simple stone marker. She was a medicine woman who helped people from many different tribes. When I was little, my grandmother would bring me here to talk to her spirit and ask for guidance. Jake could feel the peace and power of this place. It reminded him of the feeling he had experienced at the medicine wheel, where Elena had found him during the storm. There was something about this land that touched his soul in ways he could not explain. What would happen to the graves if mountain mining gets their permits? Jake asked. They would move the remains to a different cemetery, Elena said, her voice heavy with sadness. But that would break the spiritual connection. Our ancestors are supposed to rest in the earth where they lived and prayed. Moving them would be like cutting their spirits away from everything that gave their lives. Meaning, as they walked back toward the community center, Jake began to understand the true scope of what was at stake. This was not just about money or land rights. It was about the survival of a culture that went back thousands of years. That evening, Elena invited Jake to attend a tribal council meeting where the mining crisis would be discussed. Jake was nervous about being the only white person in the room, but Elena assured him that he would be welcome. The meeting was held in a circular room with traditional decorations on the walls. About 50 people attended, including tribal council, members, community leaders, and ordinary citizens who were worried about their future. The discussion was passionate but respectful. People spoke in both English and the Blackfeet language, and Jake could hear the emotion in their voices even when he could not understand the words. One young woman talked about her children and what kind of world she wanted to leave them. And the elderly man spoke about the responsibility they had to protect the land for future generations. A tribal council member explained the legal challenges they faced and the limited options available to them. When the formal discussion ended, Elena stood up to speak. "I want to introduce someone to you," she said. "This is Jake Morrison, whose grandfather helped our people during the winter of 1947. Jake has some documents that might help us fight mountain mining, but using them would require resources we don't have." Elena looked directly at Jake. "I also want you to know that mountain mining has offered Jake a lot of money to let them cross his land. If he takes that money, he can save his ranch and secure his future. If he refuses, he might lose everything his family has worked for." The room was quiet as people considered what Elena had said. Finally, the elderly woman who had remembered Jake's grandfather stood up. "Young man," she said to Jake, "your grandfather faced a similar choice long ago. He could have looked the other way when our people were suffering, or he could have risked his own interest to help us. He chose to help, and his kindness has been remembered for 3 generations." She paused and looked around the room. "Now you face the same choice your grandfather faced. But this time, the stakes are even higher. What you decide will affect not just your family and ours, but the land itself." Jake felt the weight of expectation in the room, but also something else. He felt acceptance and understanding. These people knew how hard his choice was, and they were not trying to pressure him. They were simply asking him to consider all the consequences of his decision. After the meeting, Jake and Elena drove to a hilltop that overlooked both the reservation and his ranch. From up there, Jake could see the fence line that separated their 2 worlds, but the land itself looked continuous and connected. "Elena," Jake said, "I need to ask you something personal." "What is it?" "What happens to us if I make the wrong choice?" Friday morning came too soon. Jake woke up before dawn, unable to sleep, and sat at his kitchen table drinking coffee and staring at his grandfather's documents. In a few hours, Richard Peterson would arrive expecting an answer, and Jake knew his decision would change everything. Jake had made up his mind during the long drive home from the reservation the night before. He was going to refuse mountain mining's offer, even though it meant risking his ranch and everything his family had built. Elena was right when she said that some choices change people forever. Taking blood money would make him someone he could not live with being. But Jake also had a plan that might save both his ranch and the sacred burial grounds. It was risky, and would require Elena's people to trust him completely, but it was the only path he could see that led to victory for everyone. Exactly 10 o'clock, Peterson's black sedan pulled into Jake's driveway. The mining company representative got out wearing an expensive suit and carrying a leather briefcase that probably contained contracts and a check for $2.5 million. "Mr. Morrison," Peterson said, with his usual fake smile, "I trust you've had time to consider our generous offer." "I have," Jake said, "and my answer is no." Peterson's smile disappeared instantly. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "I said no," Jake repeated. "I won't give you access rights across my land." Peterson stared at Jake like he could not believe what he was hearing. "Mr. Morrison, I think you're making a serious mistake. This is more money than you'll see in 10 lifetimes of ranching." "Maybe so," Jake said, "but some things are more important than money." Peterson's expression turned ugly. "Don't be naive, Morrison. If you think those Indians are going to thank you for this gesture, you're wrong. They don't care about you any more than we do. You're just a useful fool to them." Jake felt anger rising in his chest, but he kept his voice calm. "Mr. Peterson, I think this conversation is over. Please leave my property." Peterson's face turned red. "You'll regret this decision, Morrison. We'll find another way to access that mining site, and when we do, you'll be left with nothing but your principles and a worthless piece of land." "We'll see about that," Jake said. After Peterson left, Jake called Elena and asked her to meet him. At the community center, he had something important to discuss with the tribal council. 2 hours later, Jake stood in front of the same group of people he had met the day before. But this time, the atmosphere was different. Word had already spread that Jake had refused mountain mining's offer, and people looked at him with new respect. "I have a proposal," Jake announced. "But before I explain it, I need to know if you're willing to trust me completely, even though I'm an outsider." Robert Crow Feather, Elena's father, spoke for the group. "You've already proven yourself by walking away from that money. What do you have in mind?" Jake took a deep breath. "I want to donate my easement rights to the tribe, permanently. That way mountain mining can never get access to the burial grounds through my land, no matter what happens to me." The room erupted in surprised voices. Several people spoke at once, some in English and some in the Blackfeet language. Jake could not understand all the words, but he could hear the excitement and disbelief in their voices. Elena stared at Jake with tears in her eyes. "Jake, that's incredibly generous, but what about your ranch? How will you survive without that money?" "That's the second part of my proposal," Jake said. "I want to form a partnership with the tribe. We'll use my grandfather's legal documents to challenge mountain mining's permits, but instead of each of us fighting separately, we'll fight together as allies." Dr. Sarah Wilson, the environmental scientist, leaned forward with interest. "What kind of partnership are you thinking about?" Jake pulled out a folder containing papers he had prepared that morning. "I've been doing research on sustainable ranching and ecotourism. What if we turned our combined lands into a model for environmental conservation? We could run cattle using traditional methods that actually improve the land instead of degrading. And we could offer educational tours about Native American culture and ranching history. We could create jobs for both our communities while protecting the sacred sites." The tribal chairman, an older man named William Standing Bear, studied Jake's proposal carefully. "This is an interesting idea, but it would require significant investment. Where would the money come from?" Jake had been hoping someone would ask that question. "From the legal settlement we're going to win against mountain mining." The room fell silent. Everyone stared at Jake as if he had lost his mind. "What legal settlement?" Robert asked. Jake spread out his grandfather's documents on the table. "These papers prove that mountain mining's permits are based on fraudulent claims. My grandfather established legal protections for the sacred sites that were never properly filed with the government. If we can prove that the land rights were illegally transferred, we can not only stop the mining but also collect damages for the attempt to violate a legally binding agreement." Sam Martinez, Jake's lawyer, who had been sitting quietly in the back of the room, stood up. "Jake asked me to come here today to explain the legal situation. I've been researching these documents for the past 2 days, and I believe we have a strong case. But fighting mountain mining will require resources that none of us have individually." "What if we pool our resources?" Elena asked. "The tribe has some legal fund money and Jake has his ranch as collateral. Could we hire better lawyers?" Sam nodded. "With the right legal team and enough funding, we could not only stop the mining but also expose the corruption that allowed it to get this far. Mountain mining has been bribing officials and hiding environmental impact studies. If we can prove that in court, the damages could be substantial." William Standing Bear looked around the room at his fellow council members. "This is a big decision. We're talking about betting everything on a legal fight that could take years." An elderly woman who had been listening quietly suddenly spoke up. 60 years ago, they told us we had no choice but to accept the treaty that took most of our land. 40 years ago, they said we had no choice but to allow oil drilling on what was left. 20 years ago, they said we had no choice but to accept the casino as our only source of income." She stood up slowly, leaning on a walking stick. "Every time we believed them when they said we had no choice, we lost something that could never be replaced. Maybe it's time to stop accepting what they tell us is inevitable." The room was quiet as people considered her words. Finally, William Standing Bear called for a formal vote. All in favor of forming an alliance with Jake Morrison to fight mountain mining legally and develop a joint conservation project? One by one, hands went up around the room. When the count was finished, the vote was unanimous. Elena stood up and walked over to Jake. In front of everyone, she took his hands in hers and looked into his eyes. "My grandfather used to say that sometimes the spirits send us exactly what we need, even when we don't know we need it," she said. "I think the spirits sent you to us, Jake Morrison, and I think they sent us to you." Jake felt overwhelmed by the trust these people were placing in him. "I won't let you down," he promised. "I know you won't," Elena said, "because we're not going to let each other down." Over the next several hours, they worked out the details of their alliance. Jake would transfer his easement rights to the tribe immediately, making it legally impossible for mountain mining to access the burial grounds through his property. The tribe would provide half the funding for the legal challenge, while Jake would mortgage his ranch to pay for the other half. Sam Martinez would coordinate with tribal lawyers to hire a team of specialists in environmental law and government corruption. Dr. Wilson would organize the scientific evidence about environmental damage. Elena would handle media relations and public support. But the most important part of the plan was something that went beyond legal strategy. For the first time in generations, white ranchers and Native Americans in the area would be working together as equals toward a common goal. "This is about more than stopping one mining company," Robert Crowfeather said as the meeting ended. "This is about proving that people from different cultures can protect the land together." That evening, Jake and Elena sat on the porch of his ranch house, looking out over the land that would soon belong to both their peoples. Jake's cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, and eagles circled overhead in the fading light. "Are you scared?" Elena asked. "Terrified," Jake admitted. "I just bet everything I own on a legal case that might take years to resolve. If we lose, I'll lose my ranch, and your people will lose their sacred sites." "And if we win?" Elena asked. Jake smiled and pulled her closer. "If we win, we'll have created something completely new, a place where your culture and mine can exist together, where the land is protected and where future generations will have something beautiful to inherit." Elena leaned against Jake's shoulder. "My grandmother always said that love isn't just a feeling between two people. Real love is when two people work together to create something bigger than either of them could build alone." As the stars came out over Montana, Jake realized that his grandmother had been right. What he and Elena had found together was more than romance. It was a partnership that could change the world 1 acre at a time. The legal battle that followed was the hardest 8 months of Jake's life. Mountain mining fought back with everything they had, hiring expensive lawyers and lobbyists to pressure government officials. They challenged every document Jake's grandfather had signed and questioned the authenticity of the tribal agreements. Jake had to mortgage his ranch to pay for legal fees, and there were weeks when he was not sure he could afford to keep fighting. His cattle operation barely broke even, and he had to let Mike and Carlos go, handling all the ranch work himself. Some nights Jake lay awake wondering if he had made a terrible mistake. Elena faced her own challenges. Some members of the tribal council questioned whether they should trust a white rancher with their future, especially when the legal bills kept growing and victory seemed uncertain. A few tribal members accused her of being too influenced by her feelings for Jake, saying she was putting romance ahead of her people's interests. "You're risking everything we have for a man you've known less than a year," Tommy told her during one particularly heated family discussion. "What if he changes his mind? What if he decides the money is more important than us?" Elena understood Tommy's concerns, but she also knew Jake in ways that others did not. She had seen him choose principle over profit even when it cost him everything. She had watched him work 18-hour days to keep his ranch running while also fighting for her people's rights. The breakthrough came in month 6 of the legal battle. Dr. Sarah Wilson discovered that mountain mining had been hiding environmental impact studies that showed their operation would contaminate groundwater for 50 miles in every direction. More importantly, she found evidence that the company had bribed state officials to approve permits they knew were based on false information. Jake's legal team, led by an environmental lawyer named Margaret Chen from Denver, used this evidence to file criminal charges against mountain mining executives. Suddenly, the company was fighting for their freedom as well as their profits. The case began to attract national attention. Environmental groups rallied to support Jake and Elena's cause. Native American rights organizations provided additional legal support. Even some ranching associations came forward to condemn mountain mining's deceptive practices. Jake found himself giving interviews to newspaper reporters and television news programs. It was strange for a quiet rancher to become a public figure, but he discovered he had a talent for explaining complex issues in simple terms that ordinary people could understand. "This isn't about white people versus Native Americans," Jake told a reporter from CNN. "This is about all of us protecting the land and water that our children will inherit. Mountain mining wants to poison our environment to make a quick profit, and they're willing to lie and cheat to do it." Elena also became a media figure, speaking eloquently about the cultural and spiritual significance of the sacred sites. Her interviews helped people across the country understand that this was not just an environmental issue, but also a matter of religious freedom and cultural preservation. "Our ancestors are buried in that ground," Elena explained to a reporter from National Public Radio. "Moving their remains would be like tearing pages out of the Bible or burning down a cathedral. Some things are sacred, and no amount of money should be able to destroy them." The media attention brought support from unexpected places. Donations poured in from people who had never been to Montana but believed in the cause. Musicians organized benefit concerts. Celebrity activists offered their endorsements. Even some wealthy environmentalists provided funding for the legal battle. But the most important support came from closer to home. Ranchers throughout the region began to understand that mountain mining's contamination would affect their land, too. Several neighboring ranchers joined the lawsuit, creating a coalition that crossed racial and cultural lines. Jake's relationship with Elena deepened during the months of struggle. They spent countless hours working together on legal strategy, media relations, and fundraising. They supported each other through the darkest moments when victory seemed impossible. Their romance had to remain private during the legal proceedings. Both of them knew that mountain mining's lawyers would try to use their relationship to undermine their credibility, claiming that Elena was being manipulated by her feelings for Jake. But privately, their bond grew stronger every day. Elena moved into Jake's ranch house during the final months of the legal battle, helping him manage the property while handling her own responsibilities. They worked as a team in everything, from feeding cattle to preparing court documents. The final courtroom drama took place in federal court in Helena. Mountain mining's lawyers made one last attempt to discredit Jake's grandfather's documents, but the evidence was overwhelming. Not only were the papers authentic, but they revealed a pattern of illegal land transfers that went back decades. Judge Mayo Patricia Rodriguez, a tough federal judge with a reputation for fairness, listened to 3 days of testimony before making her ruling. The courtroom was packed with supporters from both the reservation and the ranching community. "This court finds that Mountain Mining Corporation obtained their permits through fraudulent means," Judge Rodriguez announced. "Furthermore, the evidence shows a deliberate pattern of environmental deception and government corruption that cannot be tolerated." The judge not only canceled Mountain Mining's permits but also ordered the company to pay $25 million in damages to the affected communities. It was more money than Jake or Elena had ever dreamed of winning. But the victory was about more than money. It was proof that ordinary people could defeat powerful corporations when they worked together for a just cause. Outside the courthouse, Jake and Elena were surrounded by supporters celebrating the victory. Reporters shouted questions, and photographers took pictures, but all Jake could see was Elena's radiant smile. "We did it," Elena said, taking his hands. "We actually did it." "No," Jake corrected her. "We all did it. Your people, my neighbors, everyone who believed that some things are worth fighting for." 6 months later, Jake stood at the altar of a small church near the reservation, wearing his best suit and waiting for Elena to walk down the aisle. The wedding was a mixture of traditions from both their cultures, with Native American blessing ceremonies combined with more conventional elements. Elena walked toward him, wearing a dress that combined traditional beadwork with modern design, looking more beautiful than Jake had ever seen her. Her father accompanied her down the aisle, and Jake could see tears of joy in the older man's eyes. The ceremony was conducted by both a Christian minister and a traditional Blackfeet spiritual leader. Jake and Elena exchanged vows in both English and the Blackfeet language, promising to honor each other's cultures while building something new together. After the wedding, the celebration moved to the ranch that was now jointly owned by Jake and the tribal council. The legal settlement money had been used to create the Crowfeather Morrison Conservation Foundation, which managed the combined properties as a model for sustainable ranching and cultural preservation. The old fence line between Jake's ranch and the reservation had been removed, replaced by a welcome center where visitors could learn about both ranching history and Native American culture. Buffalo once again grazed on land where they had lived for thousands of years before being driven away by European settlement. Jake's cattle operation had been converted to organic, grass-fed beef that sold for premium prices to environmentally conscious consumers. The ranch employed people from both the white and Native communities, creating jobs that honored the land instead of exploiting it. Elena continued her work as cultural preservation coordinator, but now she had resources to do much more. The foundation funded language preservation programs, traditional arts education, and archaeological research that helped recover lost aspects of Blackfeet history. Tommy Crowfeather, who had been so suspicious of Jake in the beginning, became the foundation's ranch manager. He discovered he had a talent for sustainable agriculture and helped develop grazing techniques that actually improved the health of the grassland. Mike and Carlos returned to work for Jake, but now they were part of a cooperative operation that gave them ownership stakes in the business. They learned traditional Native American ranching methods that their grandfathers had never known existed. 2 years after their wedding, Jake and Elena stood together at the medicine wheel where she had first found him dying in the snow. They came here every month to remember how their journey had begun and to pray for continued guidance. "Do you ever regret it?" Elena asked as they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and purple. "Giving up that $2.5 million?" Jake looked around at the healthy grassland, the clean streams, and the sacred sites that remained protected forever. In the distance, he could see their house where they were raising 2 adopted children from the reservation whose parents had died in a car accident. "I gave up money," Jake said, pulling Elena close, "but I gained everything that matters. A purpose, a family, a future that my grandfather would be proud of." Elena leaned against his shoulder and watched eagles circling overhead. "My grandmother always said that the spirits have a plan for everything, even when we can't see it."